Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. So one of the best things about hosting the Turning Point podcast is that we get to learn about problems that we didn't even know existed and fascinating solutions that we didn't even know were needed. For instance, Ian, did you know that the infant mortality rate in the US is the highest of any wealthy nation?
I did not know that. I did know that the US is nowhere near the top of the leaderboard in terms of health outcomes, but I had no idea about infant mortality, and I didn't know anything about accurately measuring blood flow. And I didn't think much, having spent 10 years in, working with youth and early childhood and education. I hadn't thought at all about what healthcare looks like with infants, or even, up to toddlers, young children who can't necessarily articulate their symptoms.
Yeah, it's a space that we haven't thought a ton about, nor have we thought about the impact and like what's going on in this country that leads to that kind of problem. Fortunately, Dori Jones and the founders at Acqumen Medical, they're all around this problem, and they figured out a way to combine different forms of technology to solve it, which is always something we see with successful entrepreneurs, right? Bringing different domains together. But they are actively helping to address this problem and save the lives of infants and children. It's wild.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. Like, Dori is a perfect example of this mission and vision is clear to her heart, and you can hear that. And she shares a personal story at some point in this conversation. But also, she's got this unique skill set and this unique perspective to, again, bring together these kind of divergent areas to really come up with a unique solution. And so to be a part of, witnessing her at the Groove Pitch Series, which is she's seeking capital right now for fundraising. So if any of you out there have capital, to see her and to witness that, it was pretty clear just in the 5-minute pitch that she gave to the auditorium of a couple thousand people. And it was a wonderful conversation to have. She's clearly smart, high performing, and this team is clearly going places. So it's really cool to see, and excited to see the rollout, because this organizational development process looks very different than a lot of other clients that we've talked to or conversations we've had on this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm with you 100%. Dori, when you meet her, is the kind of person you want to back, and she gets you on board with the story, and you understand the scope of the problem and why this is something that needs to be supported. And when it comes to the actual tech, Dori herself will do a much better job of telling that story than we can. So without any further ado, Dori Jones of Acqumen. All right, Dori Jones, welcome to The Turning Point.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you. Thanks for the time, Dori.
Yeah, so as I was getting to know Acqumen, on your site, I found the following piece of information. It said, mortality is higher in the US than in any other wealthy nation and has increased in recent years. That alarmed me, and I'm hoping you can tell us what's happening there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It is alarming. And I'd say particularly the fact that it's going up. You think of the United States as having all of these incredible resources and the best healthcare system in the world. And yet we have these disparities that directly impact not even just our population, but our children, which is awful. So just a few basic statistics. Infant mortality is usually measured in how many deaths per 1,000 births. And Japan, it's 1 in 1,000 births. Sweden is 2, Australia is 3, Canada is 4, and the US is between 5 and 6. So 5 and 6 deaths per 1,000 babies born. And that kind of doesn't sound like a lot, but just to put it into perspective, if you personally know 200 people, you will know somebody who loses a child before their first birthday, which is just gut-wrenching. And it's increasing for a number of reasons. Things like abortion laws, higher rates of preterm births, access to healthcare in rural communities, healthcare disparities, but even things like health of the mom. So rates of things like maternal sepsis, so infections in the mom, have gone up in recent years, and that all impacts baby. So yes, it's a staggering fact and something that I hope we can contribute to doing something about. That's not necessarily the exact problem that we're solving, but if we can contribute to the solution in any way, then we will.
And just to clarify, Dory, we're not talking about miscarriages or stillbirths. We're talking about deaths after birth.
Infant death, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And yeah, just to elaborate on that, some people might have heard the terms NICU or PICU. Can you just tell us what those are and just what like critical care for babies and infants tends to be like?
Yeah, so the NICU is the neonatal ICU. So basically, that is for children born in distress. So whether they have a particular condition or they're just not breathing the way that they're supposed to or getting circulation of the blood the way that they're supposed to, they immediately go into critical care of the ICU. And so a lot of people refer to it as the NICU. Anyone older than a newborn baby, but younger than 18, would go to a pediatric ICU. And so that means the child, even if it's a baby, has been home already. They end up in the hospital, typically through the ED, and they end up in critical care, so in an intensive care unit. And so, in short, we call them NICU and PICU, but
Gotcha.
ICU.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're right. You said many people are very fortunate. Their infants and babies do not have to go into any sort of critical care. So this is a niche of the medical industry I think some people may not be aware of.
Yes. I feel like maybe because of the higher rates of preterm births, things like twins tend to end up in the NICU at higher rates than single births. And so I think I personally know a lot of people that have an experience with the NICU. My own son was in the NICU, which I'm sure we'll get into. And I feel like when I share my story and my connection to the work that we're doing to support babies and children in critical care, a lot of people tell me about their personal connection to specifically the NICU. Thankfully, even fewer people have an experience in the pediatric ICU. I also have that experience, and thankfully, my son's doing okay. But the NICU is actually one of the higher rates of ICU admissions in our country. There's quite a lot of babies that end up in critical care, and thankfully, a lot of them go home.
Okay, so let's talk about this new term I am learning from you and from Acqumen, hemodynamic measurement. So maybe you can start by explaining what it is, why it's so valuable for diagnosis and treatment, and why it's so difficult to get that data when it comes to babies and infants.
Yeah, absolutely. So hemodynamics, I'll break it down. Hemo means blood and dynamics means movement. So hemodynamics is literally how does blood move throughout the body. And so a lot of people connect it with cardiac measurements or heart, something related to the heart, which it is in many ways, but understanding hemodynamics is important for a whole range of different conditions or states that a patient may be in, because that's how you get oxygen to the brain. That's how you get blood flow to the kidneys. So it impacts a lot of different aspects of your overall human body. And, as a working system, you need blood flow in order to maintain homeostasis, which is sort of like your baseline healthy state. So hemodynamics can include things like cardiac output, literally how many liters per minute of blood is flowing through the body, but also things like how restricted are your blood vessels? And of course, blood pressure and heart rate are included in that. And pretty much everybody's heard of blood pressure and heart rate. You're getting it every time you go to the doctor, not just for, a well visit, but really for any doctor's visit. They want to understand what your vital signs are. Because of the ease of use of the newer pulse ox measurements, which is the finger cuff, which a lot of people learned about during COVID, but is now sort of ubiquitous in healthcare, you get a baseline oxygen level as well. So those are considered vital signs. And the reason you know about them is they're pretty easy to get. You put a cuff, you can listen to somebody's heart with a stethoscope to understand their heart rate, or you could even just hold their wrist and count. And now with pulse ox, you can get a pretty decent reading of their oxygen levels. The reason you haven't heard about cardiac output, which is actually how much blood is flowing through the body, really important, is it's really hard to obtain. So the most accurate way to understand a patient's blood flow is to put a catheter inside their neck. They snake it into the heart, into a blood vessel, and they take direct measurements from the heart. And so that's a really invasive and intense procedure. So typically that's done in a cath lab. So people with advanced heart failure will likely get a cardiac output measurement, other, specific heart conditions, but you're not seeing it in your everyday doctor's visits because it's invasive. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to tackle with our innovation UltraTrack is how can we get accurate measurements of things like cardiac output and a range of other parameters without breaking the skin.
So, Dori, we're going to dive into that, but can you clarify or maybe just help some of the listeners like myself understand, like, when would a doctor need to understand cardiac output?
Well, I will say if it was as easy to get as blood pressure and heart rate, you'd probably be getting it at every doctor visit.
Okay.
So blood pressure is essentially how strong is your blood pumping, right? So how much pressure is there or how much resistance is there to the blood flowing? And heart rate is how fast. But cardiac output is how much. So if you just think from like basic science standpoint, right? So speed, pressure, and volume are the three sort of scientific parameters that would give you information about a particular state in physics. And so it's really important in understanding how oxygen and nutrients are delivered to all of the vital organs. So if a patient was, let's say, at risk of a concussion, it'd be really useful to know what their cardiac output was. If a patient was in respiratory distress, they were having trouble breathing, it would be helpful to understand, how much blood is making it throughout the body with that lower level of oxygen to make sure that you're maintaining blood flow and oxygen levels in all of your organs and tissues. And so it's not just for heart patients. So, although, of course, if you have a patient that has compromised heart function, it's really critical to understand cardiac output.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and maybe you could give us an example too of how like an infant in critical care might need something like this.
Yeah, so some of the target areas for us when we think about who would be good candidates for UltraTrack for measuring their cardiac output would be patients born with some type of congenital heart defect or what we now call congenital heart disease. And just to put that in perspective, congenital heart disease is 20 times more prevalent than pediatric cancer. So this is actually one of the largest problems in infants that are in a critical condition is congenital heart disease. And so certainly understanding everything having to do with their heart function is important in treating them. But we also look at patients with sepsis, which is a life-threatening infection. And interestingly, in the case of sepsis, or if a patient is at risk of sepsis, you actually see their cardiac output go up as opposed to going down. So that's really one of the first indications of that life-threatening infection. So monitoring cardiac output helps with that. Respiratory disease. So I mentioned patients with breathing issues. That's a common cause for patients being admitted to the NICU in particular, but also in the pediatric ICU. And any sort of trauma. So burn patients have a lot of issues with maintaining fluid balance, and fluid balance is really impacted by blood flow. And patients who may have bleeding issues. So understanding how much blood is flowing throughout the body is really critical if you have a patient that's actively bleeding. So a lot of different ways that you can use cardiac output.
Okay, so it sounds like you got a lot of different valuable use cases and a lot of ways in which you can get basically more accurate diagnoses of these potential conditions.
Yeah, so I think of using hemodynamics in three ways. One is to identify problems, right? So understanding what the patient has or what they're at risk of, and monitoring is really important for that, right? So not just let me do a spot check of their blood pressure, but having a continuous reading of something like cardiac output. You can see cardiac output go down actually well before you see a change in blood pressure or heart rate, because your body has a really incredible way of sort of maintaining your blood pressure at all costs. And so by the time your blood pressure crashes, the patient is crashing. Whereas cardiac output, you can see a change earlier. So early identification of problems is one important piece. And then using those hemodynamics as part of the full picture in diagnosing a patient or understanding the severity of that condition, right? So, okay, now we know they have reduced blood flow, but how bad is it and how has it changed over time? And then the third way to use hemodynamics is to actually guide the treatment. So, how are we fixing them? In the case of a patient whose cardiac output is crashing, their blood flow is crashing, then you need to give them some type of stimulant drug to get their heart pumping harder, faster. And to be able to monitor their cardiac output, once you give them that treatment, you can actually confirm whether you've improved that blood flow so that they can recover. But there's a lot of other interventions or drugs or therapies that a patient may get where you can see the impact by monitoring their hemodynamics.
That's so cool. I mean, I've heard. I'm not an MD. No, nobody else on on this podcast is. But I
Me
have
neither.
heard. Yeah, I have heard some MDs refer to the body as a little bit of a black box, and right, you're always trying to get as much information as you can. And this sounds like you're just getting a much more accurate picture of what's happening live, and it's going to allow MDs to act with better information.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So also not an MD, but I am a mechanical engineer. And so the idea of the sort of fluid dynamics and mechanical understanding of the heart, I mean, hemodynamics is kind of my sweet spot. It's like as close to medicine as I can get as a mechanical engineer. But absolutely, one of our goals is individualized care, right? Understanding exactly what's happening with this particular patient and then being able to treat them.
Yes, that's so cool. We get so many people on this podcast who have this funny Venn diagram of multiple areas of expertise and find themselves in this position of being able to innovate because they bring something, a different skill set into this other domain. That's so cool. Now is where I think it might be a good time to explain how this technology works, right? So you have this phenomenon occurring in the body. It's hard to measure, and it's hard to measure continuously. What is it that the Acqumen technology solved? How did you figure out how to do this?
Yeah. So I have to give a huge nod to our Chief Technology Officer, David Lerner. So he's the brains behind our innovation, which is called UltraTrack. And it's actually a combination of two different techniques of measuring blood flow, and we put them together to address some specific limitations of each. So the first is an impedance technology, where we use electrodes on the skin, much like an EKG. But instead of looking at electrical activity, which is what an EKG does, we're actually looking at the flow of fluid through the body. And so we have electrodes that go across the chest and measure the impedance or the resistance to flow, and then we can sort of back calculate what the patient's blood flow is or what their cardiac output is. And this is a type of technology that's been around for decades, but it's not ever gotten widespread adoption because it's not particularly accurate. It's okay for trending, but it sometimes can get these weird measurements because there might be noise from the patient moving around or things like that, where the absolute value of that cardiac output number is not close enough to the measurement that you would get from putting that catheter in the patient's neck, right? So there's not been enough trust in that measurement, but
So
it
can I,
does offer continuous measurements, which
yeah, so
is,
just to clarify, for those of us who have no engineering or anything background, right? So when you say
yeah,
measures resistance, right? You got two electrodes that are separate from each other. There's a little current that's flowing between them, and you're measuring
yes.
how well the current flows, and somehow the resistance of the current is giving an indicator of how much blood is flowing.
Yeah, so you actually explained that like an engineer, Justin. So I'd say you do have a pretty good understanding.
I'm
So
giving myself a badge for that. Thank you.
yes, you definitely get a gold star. So The current that you mentioned is going to take the path of least resistance. So anytime you have an electrical current flowing through the body, it's going to want to follow, the path of least resistance actually is the blood coming from the heart, going into the aorta, and then out to the rest of the body. So the aorta is the biggest blood vessel in your body, and it then splits off to all the different branches that send blood to your brain and to your kidneys and to everything else. And so that electrical current is basically following the blood flowing through the aorta. And we produce a waveform, and the area under the curve of that waveform is volume. And so that's how we're calculating cardiac output. So I mentioned cardiac output is liters per minute of blood flow. So if we measure the patient's volume of blood and multiply it by their heart rate, that's how you get cardiac output.
Okay, and then you mentioned that was just one of the two pieces of technology. Yeah.
Exactly. That's piece one. Piece two is a miniature ultrasound device. So ultrasound is known as a way of measuring blood flow. And specifically, we use Doppler ultrasound in this version of UltraTrack. And the problem with ultrasound is usually you're having a tech, a sonographer, or a physician do an assessment with an ultrasound device, with an ultrasound probe. So much like you've seen on, a woman's pregnant belly, but that can be done in all different areas of the body. For example, you can put an ultrasound device on the patient's carotid artery, which is sending blood from the heart up to the brain. So it's a really important artery to be looking at, and you can measure blood flow through that artery. But it's a spot measurement. You're not getting it continuously. And there's a lot of variability depending on the person doing that ultrasound assessment. Now, if we do think about patients with a heart condition, a lot of times those patients will get what's called an echocardiogram or an echo, which is an ultrasound of the heart. And in that case, they're doing all sorts of different measurements, including blood flow. But that takes a trained, physician or a trained sonographer to do that assessment. And that's not always practical if you're in a high stakes critical care environment like the NICU or pediatric ICU. So the ability to measure continuously and without that level of expertise is important. But that's what the impedance device is giving us. And so what UltraTrack does is we use measurements from the impedance device, and then we take some details from an ultrasound, a miniature ultrasound sensor that goes on the patient's carotid artery on their neck and combines the two together. So now we're getting more accurate measurements because of the ultrasound, but we get the continuous measurements because of the impedance.
I'm curious, obviously for those of us that aren't MDs, this is a more sophisticated conversation. But I would assume that in the medical world, the understanding of the value of these measurements is relatively well understood. So has nobody tried this before? And if somebody has, why have you all succeeded where others may have failed?
Yes, there are impedance devices that measure cardiac output, but I mentioned the limitations are specific to that accuracy of the numbers. And there are some ultrasound companies that have attempted to improve the measurements, despite needing that highly trained clinician or sonographer. So for example, there are new ultrasound technologies that use AI to sort of take on some of the data capture that's required for ultrasound assessment. What nobody has done before is to put these two together into a single device. And we're sort of uniquely suited for this particular problem because our chief technology officer is this ultrasound expert. He's been innovating in the ultrasound space for over 30 years. And early in our journey, before we officially formed Acqumen, we brought in our chief science officer, who's an emergency medicine physician who's been studying impedance devices for over 30 years. And so we're not just combining the technologies, we're also combining the expertise of our team. And so I think in a lot of ways, we're doing this at the right time because of the advancements in these technologies, the ability to incorporate things like AI tools, the ability to miniaturize our ultrasound sensor, which is about the size of a dime. So there's There's incredible advancements in technology, so it feels like the right time for this, and it's also the right team.
The technology sounds fascinating. It's obviously a problem that has a high value for somebody to solve it. But what brings you here, and how did this team come together around this problem, and why is there so much passion and effort going into it?
So I'll start a little bit with my background. I mentioned I'm an engineer, and I've been in the cardiac and critical care device industry for 18 years. So I've had a lot of experience with invasive devices, actually, things like implantable heart pumps, where they actually take over the function of the heart for patients with heart failure. And that really got me initially interested in the idea of hemodynamics, right? Because as a mechanical engineer who thought I was going to work on cars, the idea that the heart is a pump really excited me. And so understanding how that works and sort of the physics behind it was a driving factor for me in my early career. And then I had the opportunity to work in the OR and in the ICU for a company that was doing clinical trials for one of those heart pumps. And that's where I really got all of my medical knowledge. I had no medical training whatsoever. I hadn't even taken a bio class since high school. So I did go back to school and get a master's in biomedical engineering, but it was really the OR and the ICU that were sort of my clinical training ground. And that's when I started to kind of understand the problems that clinicians faced. Because when you're an engineer behind the desk, you can only assume what you're creating is going to fix something. But when you're in a clinical environment, you can see every day the problem solving that they do. It's part of being a clinician, is that you're problem solving every day, and maybe you're using technology to help. And so it was a space that I was already passionate about. And 3 of our 5 co-founders of Acqumen Medical worked together at a company that had an adult heart failure device, actually for fluid management, that was being used off-label in babies. And so that was my first exposure to pediatric healthcare. And I went to some of the children's hospitals that were using our technology. And that was really exciting because now I was looking at a whole different level of problem solving because they don't have as much technology. There's very few companies innovating specifically for pediatric patients. And so they have to do a lot of MacGyvering, jerry-rigging, putting things together on their own. And it's incredible to watch, but it's also discouraging that they don't have the same tools that you have to treat adult patients. So I had kind of this basic drive for innovating in the pediatric space. But at the time that David Lerner, our CTO, who, as I said, is the brains behind UltraTrack, came to me with this idea. My son, who had been in the NICU, thankfully for a short time, was in and out of the hospital, and he ended up back in the ICU when he was 4 months old. And the way that happened was we went to our local emergency department. He was struggling to breathe. His oxygen levels were low, and our community hospital said, we can't handle this here. And they put us in an ambulance to the closest academic medical center, which was 45 minutes away. And there, the doctors tried several treatments to get his oxygen levels up, but he wasn't getting better, and he ended up on a breathing machine. And I, as the mechanical engineer in medical devices, was kind of looking at everything in that ICU. What are they using to monitor him? What parameters are they looking at? What does this machine do? I was silencing alarms. I was that patient or that parent that the nurses hate because I was playing with things. But I was like, they just don't have the monitoring tools that are required to fully understand what's happening with my son or in general, these patients. And so I went back to the team and I said, we have to look at pediatric critical care. And I started interviewing neonatologists, pediatric intensivists, pediatric cardiologists, pediatric anesthesiologists, a lot of different specialties, but in pediatrics, and had an overwhelming response. If you can give us non-invasive cardiac output, how can we help you? Tell us how we can help. And so that felt like a company at that point. And not necessarily just because of our solution, but because of the problem.
So how old was your son when you were going through this?
He was 4 months old when he was in the pediatric ICU.
I'm sure you've told this story many times and you're able to tell it now without, I guess, as much emotional baggage. But the idea of you sitting in there fiddling with the hardware while your son is in critical condition is really something.
It was definitely it was a harrowing time. I mean, I think I'm able to talk about it now because he's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned before that when I tell my story, a lot of people shared their own connection to the NICU or the ICU with their children or themselves. I've actually had a number of people say, I was a NICU baby.
Mm.
And there's some kind of unspoken connection there when you have that shared experience. But I have had people say, oh, I had a NICU baby, and I always ask how they're doing. And most of the time, like me, they say, hey, he's fine or she's fine. And there's been a few times where they've said they didn't make it or that they weren't doing okay. And I appreciate people sharing that because that's what pushes me forward every day, that we have to make this happen. If it helps one patient, it will be worth it.
Yeah. I mean, you clearly have, well, being the mechanical engineer, you have this kind of tinkerer mindset, but I can only imagine what it would be like to go through that experience personally as a mother. And I'm curious how being a founder has either challenged you as an individual, like personally or professionally, or how has it supported you and your nature? Like where does this Venn diagram of your person and your profession kind of come together in terms of your like founder skills and leadership?
Yeah. Well, if you find a founder that hasn't felt challenged, then please connect me with them because I want to know their secret. It's definitely a roller coaster. And I mentioned that my son was 4 months old when he was in the pediatric ICU. He just turned 3. And so when I founded the company, he was 2. It's really hard to be a founder with little kids. I have an older son too, who's 7. And I meet a lot of founders whose kids are grown or who don't have kids yet. I think it's a weird time in my life to have chosen to kind of just dive in head first and dedicate a lot of my time, most of my time to this idea and this business. So it's definitely a challenge. I mean, it helps that our mission is to help kids, right? I mean, how could I not be driven by that? But I think for me, the idea of being a founder kind of happened by accident. It really is because of my team. They said, hey, Dori, you should lead this company. You should drive this. And I'm almost glad that it wasn't my idea first because I think that they instilled a confidence in me that helped me have sort of a learning attitude. I feel like I'm drinking from the fire hose. I've worn a lot of different hats in the medical device space, and I'm fortunate to have had that sort of wide breadth of experience. But it's my first time as a founder, first time as a CEO, first time in a fundraising role. I've done it in nonprofits, but that's very different. And so I do need those mentors and those guides to help me through, and my team's been amazing with that. But I also think that's sort of the nature of a founder is jack of all trades, master of none. I do know all of the pieces that will need to come together to make UltraTrack successful. I'm learning a lot now about building a business and funding a business. But once we can get UltraTrack on the market, that's when I know how to take it and run with it. So it felt right, even if it wasn't exactly the right time, having little kids at home.
Yeah. So you mentioned that your team really asked you to take this position, but you didn't really say why. Why do you know why they were interested in having you be in this position?
Well, I think that for specifically the team members that I've worked with in the past, which is John and David, again, we're 3 of the 5 co-founders, have worked together for many years. They've sort of seen me maybe take on leadership roles within that company in a certain way. And I was getting to the point of doing things like commercial strategy. So I think that's a big piece of it. But we also, all 5 of us, were working on another startup together. I was a strategic advisor for a startup that also has an ultrasound innovation. They're called Acqumen Medical. And I learned a lot about a startup and what it takes to be successful and what that early stage process is like. And so I think that was sort of the push for me. I've worked for companies that are small and I've worked for big companies like Abbott and Medtronic. And I sort of know that the small companies are more my vibe. I like wearing a lot of hats. I like having a small team where you have this kind of excitement of the ability to grow, and the ability to work fast. I mean, we don't have a lot of red tape. We're going to just keep pushing it forward as fast as we can.
That's interesting. We do talk to a lot of founders in early stage, and they say similar things about being comfortable in the unknown, wearing a lot of different hats, and being willing and comfortable to learn how to wear different hats, even if it's not something they've had a ton of experience doing. So not surprising to hear, and I think that'd be validating for a lot of the other founders that we talk to.
The
I think not only have we heard that, but it's also part of the reason that we founded our company. Because with all of the myriad of challenges in the world to solve, it's the early stage, right? The sprint stage where you have less red tape in most industries, right? It depends on the industry you're in, obviously. And for us, the kind of theory of change was, well, if we can help some of these smaller companies grow to become viable players in their market, then we can increase the amount of options that are available to us collectively, and right, and like that's a way to contribute to the common good. So it's actually interesting to hear you say that, because it's a validator, I think, for us in terms of, how we think about our work, which doesn't always necessarily show up that way in practice, because we're often in the weeds. But I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. Well, how do you maximize impact? And so I really appreciate what you guys are doing and having that view and that vision.
Yeah. So speaking of the early stage, Dory, can you talk to us about where Acumen is at, and what are the wins so far in this early stage development process, and what are the big obstacles you guys are working through at the moment?
Yeah, so a lot of our wins have to do with our partnerships. So I mentioned that we've had an overwhelmingly positive response from clinicians. We've gone on to build really important relationships with those clinicians at really leading children's hospitals across the country. And so the most exciting milestone for Acqumen Medical happened just a month and a half ago, which was the first hospital approval for a clinical study of UltraTrack, meaning we're getting into patients. So this is a study that's sponsored by one of our clinical partners, meaning they're so invested in this solution that they want to guide the validation of our device and our innovation. So that's been a huge win for us, and really shifting then from a company with an idea and a bunch of engineers doing testing and putting the device on my kids because, hey, it's non-invasive, to a clinical stage company, which is so exciting. I mean, we're going to get real patient data. So that's been huge. And then there's these other partnerships that we've built specifically to drive pediatric healthcare innovation. So there's not a lot of companies doing this, but there is a lot of support for it. So one really amazing resource that we've been able to take advantage of is the FDA started several years ago these pediatric device consortia. So it's groups around the country that are collaborations between academic centers, universities, and children's hospitals, with the primary goal of creating innovation for children and babies. And so that sometimes comes with grant funding. We've won a couple grants through these device consortia, but it's also access to key opinion leaders, access to resources from all the different aspects that it takes to get a device, specifically a device, out to the market. So we have to be thinking about regulatory. We have to get through FDA. We have to be thinking about reimbursement. Who's going to pay for this solution? We have to be thinking about clinical adoption and what that will take. So sort of from a marketing standpoint, and the actual clinical research that drives that clinical adoption. So many different pieces have to come together for a technology to be successful. It working is just one piece of that puzzle, but I'm really proud of our team that we did get to the point of a working UltraTrack that we can now test in patients. It's a huge first step.
That's so cool. And I also think it's really good for the public to hear what the path is like for technology like this. I can imagine people out there saying, wow, this is phenomenal. I hope this is happening as fast as possible and this is available should I be in this situation as a parent. And then you hear, oh my gosh, regulatory, clinical adoption, reimbursement, and you hear all of the obstacles in the healthcare space.
Exactly. Yes. There's a lot that has to come together to make it work. And thankfully, we have access to these resources to help us with those hurdles and those challenges and those questions. I think that's very much an overarching theme with me as a first-time founder, is not just knowing to ask the questions, but what questions do I even need to be asking? And that's where these resources are really helpful. I should mention we're also in a pediatric healthcare accelerator. So very specific, very niche. We were in the inaugural cohort. It's called the Spark for Innovation in Pediatrics Accelerator. It's a collaboration between Children's National and BARDA, which is a government agency under the HHS, which looks at medical countermeasures. So kind of how can we help specifically children, although they do adults as well, with, addressing health security threats. What's the next pandemic? And how can we make sure that we have innovation to address it?
Yeah, and we try to specifically avoid politics in this show, but I do think this is a great example for people to understand what public and private partnership looks like.
Yes.
And that what public agencies actually do to support innovation is super critical. Back to where I was heading, which is exactly what you said, the pathway to commercialization. I'm just wondering, I know this is a hard question to answer, but I'm wondering if you can give people an idea of how long the pathway to commercialization might actually be.
2027.
Okay.
That's the short answer. As I said, the great thing about a startup is that you can work quickly as a team, even though we have all of these sort of hoops to jump through to get there. One of the things that we have helping us is our impedance device actually has regulatory approval. It was really intended for adults, so there's a lot of modifications and improvements that will go into that. But that does help our strategy with getting to market considerably. We're not starting from scratch with the FDA. And the other thing, which is very much a common misconception, is that the FDA wants to get pediatric technologies and solutions out there. So while people may think, oh, it's much harder to get a pediatric device or a pediatric drug approved, it is in the FDA's interest to push and accelerate these types of innovations because they are so needed and there's not enough people doing it. So we actually think that we can do way fewer in the way of the number of patients that we need to test on, the types of clinical trials, if that's even needed. And there's newer ways that are really being adopted by the FDA and companies to get devices approved, like what's called in silico trials, means you basically create a computer version of patients and test the device or the drug on that instead of live patients, which when you're talking about pediatrics is really important because we're lucky we have a non-invasive device, but not everything for pediatrics is non-invasive. Think about all the ethics that go into studying a device in children and babies. So, you really have to be careful there, but it's such a need that I actually think we have stronger partnership with the regulatory bodies. And again, all the support from the clinical community to help drive it faster.
I can speak with some expertise being a researcher, right? Balancing risk and harm versus potential benefits. And it's good. It's good to hear that everybody who has a stake in this is recognizing the size of the benefit.
Right.
It's also really fascinating. You're not the first person I've heard about these synthetic test participant or test subject concepts. Yeah. And this is fascinating. This was not in play when I was doing my research degree. The fact that this is even an option I don't even know what to say about it right now. I'm very uneducated, but
we're looking at this idea of creating a digital twin, which is something that's talked about more and more now in the healthcare space. So not just monitoring a patient, but predicting outcomes based on whatever intervention or treatment you're considering. And that's something where our chief science officer, the one who's, had a lot of experience with impedance devices, has a ton of expertise. He was actually the lead scientist for NASA's Digital Astronaut Project. So he created a computer model of the human body with thousands and thousands of data inputs where you could actually test different conditions on the human body. So the idea then was, if we send an astronaut to Mars, how is their body going to react and respond? But we can use it for things like hemodynamics as well.
At the time of this recording, we are at the end of November in 2025, and you labeled 2027 as the year of commercialization.
Yes.
So we've talked a bit about, some of the barriers to adoption, but could you, maybe for the listeners who are out there who are, maybe they're excited about this, maybe they have some resources they think they might be able to help. What are some of the primary constraints or like organizational development milestones that you need to get through between now and 2027 to actually, get this live?
Yeah, so I believe really strongly on designing for the user. And so we've been fortunate that we've had such incredible access to these clinicians, but I'm still looking for access specifically to NICU and PICU nurses, because they're going to be the ones really setting up our device, interpreting the information from the device. And one huge thing that a lot of people overlook in the early development stages of a medical device is human factors and usability. And that is a big piece of getting through the FDA. And so really understanding from as many voices as possible how to make this user friendly is a big piece. Obviously, capital is an important piece. We're pursuing both dilutive and non-dilutive funding pathways to get us to commercialization. And awareness. We live in a world of social media and hundreds of startups. And how do we set ourselves apart? I mean, I think being a pediatric medical device company certainly, again, is niche and sets us apart a little bit. But how do we not get lost in the shuffle as a business focused on this very specific problem? And so I think it's huge to be able to share our story on podcasts like The Turning Point. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time. So, Justin, she mentioned human factors, and I know that's actually in your PhD title. So, do you want to like unleash the Kraken for a moment, or do you want
Oh
to
my
shift
gosh, yeah,
into?
tell me.
Yeah, I studied human learning. So, but I was in
Okay.
I in my cohort, lots of medical device people, obviously, and the woman who
Yeah.
started my program at the University of Minnesota was a medical process engineer.
Wow, how
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Well,
So
we have a lot of connections to University of Minnesota, so
yeah, maybe for me, I just thought it was a general use perspective. Just like you said, really thinking about user experience and taking a highly empathetic approach at, predominantly at the beginning of the design process and like throughout development. And it really changed the way I thought about everything I did.
yeah.
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 And
Yeah.
I almost brought that up because I heard when you were talking about interviewing all of the clinicians about what their biggest problems were, I was like, man, that's a design approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Very cool.
Yeah. There's a, I'm going to totally bring this like way down because this conversation is over my head at this point. But it's this like classic and kind of cliche analogy around the iceberg. Like the amount of, well, maybe to use today's word, like the volume underneath the surface, like the amount of space underneath the surface of something that is commercialized is really hard for a consumer to understand if they don't have some of the insider understanding and awareness, like you were saying. And so, for the listeners out there, if you've got connections to NICU or PICU nurses or funding or others that you can share this with, like let's move the process along. Okay, Dory, we always like to end with the set of same few questions.
Okay.
Um, so they're big asks, an opportunity for you to speak directly to the audience or to advise directly for the listeners. So, what is one of the highest leverage system level changes that could help move a technology like this forward?
So I think a big piece is having an understanding of the gaps that exist in pediatric healthcare. And so I addressed one misconception, which is that it's harder to get a pediatric device or drug through the FDA. That's not necessarily true. But let me address another common misconception, and that's that, oh, the pediatric healthcare space is small. It's too small to invest in, or that's not where we should be putting our resources. or even just that it's not a big problem. I've never heard of a sick kid in the ICU. Well, that person's lucky, but the truth is it's about 600,000 infants and children admitted to an ICU in our country every year. So it's not that small of a problem. And it's not that small of a market either. And just to put things in perspective, the US healthcare system spends $230 billion on pediatric healthcare. So it's, yes, a portion of our population. It's 25% of our population, but we like to say it's 100% of our future, right? So why not dedicate more resources to pediatric healthcare, to innovation for pediatric patients? And, not just for investors, but on a broader scale, I think that there's certainly some problems at an institution level or at a policy level, where I think our country tends to focus a lot on the short term. And that's one area that pediatrics can get overlooked, is that there are a lot of pediatric problems, whether it's rare disease or otherwise, that are long term, right? So resources needing to be expended over the course of a child's lifetime. But there's a lot that you can do to intervene at the beginning, right? And so I think for the whole pediatric healthcare space to be able to push forward is to get enough voice behind that mission that this is a problem and it deserves the level of attention that a lot of other problems in the healthcare system get today.
Thanks, Dori. I think before we move on to the second question, we haven't even talked about incentivization today. And I think we could spend another hour simply talking about that and what it looks like, but I'll put a pin in that because I think it's real. I'm sure you've got a bunch of thoughts on it too. So here's the advice question. What is one piece of advice you have for other founders that might be listening?
I would say take a piece of your origin story into everything that you do. So for me, I have this personal connection to our work. And I think most founders do have that. Early on, when I first started pitching, I actually didn't share my son's story. And I think part of that was being protective. Part of that was not wanting to be exploitative. But the truth is, it's a huge piece behind what Acqumen is doing and why we're focused on pediatrics. And so I think really making that part of your business and your company's story is critical to getting other people to care about it. Because in the end, we're humans with emotions, and that's often how we make our decisions. And if you're a founder, you're probably not doing it for fun. You're doing it to make change in the world. So keep that piece of your personal connection, whatever it may be, in mind with everything that you do, whether that's pitching to a potential investor or being up late finishing that application or working directly on your solution. I think it really helps with our own emotions as founders because it is a roller coaster. So,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. As the saying goes, a good why can bear anyhow.
Yes. Yes.
And it can be fun for those of us with masochistic tendencies.
Oh gosh, yeah. That's another hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a decade for me.
Yeah.
Okay, last question, Dori. What is one individual level thing that patients or care providers could do to accelerate access to your technology?
Share your story. So if you're a NICU or a PICU parent like me, talk about it. I think it helps to talk about it anyway, from a personal level. But spreading that awareness helps companies like ours. And also to share your own drive towards making pediatric healthcare innovation happen. So there's a lot of people that I've met that have kids that were healthy, but they're grateful for that and they share that as well. And so really anybody whose lives are touched by kids, can kind of share in our mission. So follow us on social media at Acqumen Medical on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So that's ACQUMEN Medical. and reach out to us through our website, accumenmedical.com. If you want to share a story, I actually put a personal NICU or PICU story in each one of our newsletters. So if you have a story to share, I'd love to hear it. And if you're willing to have it shared, share it with our newsletter recipients.
That's great. And if there's anything else you want to plug, Dori, now is a great time.
I can't think of anything right now.
All right.
I'll plug for you.
The first thing that came to my mind is like, if you need to get your kids to help with your business, bribe them with chocolate. Because that's how I got my kids to sit for me, putting my device on them. But yeah, that's very specific.
I'll plug one for you, Dori.
Okay.
Which is we learned about you at the Groove pitch series.
Yeah.
So like you mentioned, you're actively pursuing capital. And like it or not, economics make things like this move. So if there's anybody out there with capital, reach out.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you share our mission, because that's the future, is our children. Thank you.
Well said, Dori. And I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. So, Dori Jones, thank you for being on The Turning Point.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me share my story.
Happy to help you do it. Big thanks to Dori Jones of Acqumen Medical for coming on the show. You can learn more about their innovative tech at accumenmedical.com. That's ACQUMEN medical.com. And if you're a mission-driven leader or founder looking to grow your impact, you can check us out at stillpointinsight.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.